Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy, folks. Today in the studio, I have the pleasure of recording this podcast with my colleague and friend, Anushka Saxena. She's a staff research analyst at the Takshashila Institution. I am Ashwin Prasad. I am also a staff research analyst here. And today we have a topic that both of us are interested in and have spoken about before at work and thought it would make for a great conversation here, which is surrounding the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump at Busan in South Korea on the 30th of October. This was a pretty consequential meeting considering that it was the leaders of the largest two economies in the world. And it came after a series of, maneuvers in what has been called the trade war between US and China. There was sanctions and tariffs and retaliatory measures coming from both sides. And it was a clear economic confrontation between the two countries. And so the meeting was naturally about a lot of these economic confrontational issues that the two countries wanted to sort out. And there's a lot to unpack here, so we can dive right into it. Anushka, do you have any thoughts on the meeting and all of the context that surrounds it?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ashwin. I think this was definitely a meeting, at least in the run-up to it, that not just academics and scholars following the subject, but also folks sitting in boardrooms, folks in the government, bureaucrats from around the world were looking forward to. And that is, as you alluded, precisely because it came after a lot of wrangling between the commerce representatives, Treasury on the US's side, Ministry of Commerce on China's side, meetings between them in Geneva and London across the year. And so eventually there was anticipation that, when two leaders meet, and mind you, two leaders of, like you said, the two biggest economies, it's going to be about serious announcements, because all the groundwork has already been laid through the meetings in April, May, June, and July, right? And naturally, these meetings and this groundwork also happened despite the conviction we initially thought Trump would have vis-a-vis China. These meetings happened because somewhere or the other, the brunt of 50% tariffs on China was felt by American consumers and manufacturers. In fact, we have Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, on record saying that, there's no point restricting the flow and the export of artificial intelligence GPUs to China because it's only going to hurt profitability. And that cost will eventually have to be borne by downstream suppliers and maybe even consumers, right? So that's the kind of sentiment that was created by government actions on even the Chinese side, given that there is an issue of overcapacity in the Chinese economy. It's well established. And profitability margins are really taking a hit because domestic consumption and demand is not being stirred to the extent that the CPC would want. And international markets are becoming hostile. On both sides, you saw an industry government clash because the trade war and the technological war is very much a reality. And it was rightly so anticipated that the world is going to see some semblance of stability come out even though no one here, not especially in this episode, is arguing that a thaw or a bonhomie was expected of any sort. In fact, we often discuss and argue at Takshashila that US-China economic and technological competition is going to continue to remain a feature of geopolitics and the world order, whether it's in flux or it's already made. You choose your mind about that, right? But nonetheless, what we saw in the meeting were a few concessions that are valuable. And, of course, both sides came out with readouts on some of these things. And we can get to what both sides had to say post the meeting, what both leaders had to say post the meeting in the thick of it in the episode. But the point is that largely there is consensus on both sides, both verbally and in written, that they are going to make some room. And none of the concessions, quote unquote, if I can call them that, are about shedding competitive rigor or about really accommodating the other side's interests and being empathetic, but rather about delaying the rather drastic repercussions to 1 year later, to 6 months to 1 year later, even as the two sides continue to be in a state of co-opetition, if I can say that. So I think that's my broad abstraction from the meeting, but happy to get into the thick of it going forward.
And one interesting thing that you've also written about, and I also noticed in the readouts, was that while the style of diplomacy that was practiced in this meeting was controlled and tempered, there was attention paid to how it is being framed to the audience. Trump declared victory on a lot of issues. Clearly, the soybean exports and some of the agricultural exports from by the exports from the US to China was a important factor for him, and the Chinese never actually admitted that there was any concessions made in the deal. Do you have perhaps any thoughts on how that was done? And this seems to be an interesting case of foreign policy and international diplomacy also having deep-rooted local and electoral issues, right?
Yeah. So the one thing to note about Chinese signaling in the aftermath of the meeting is that they came out with two press releases. The first that came almost immediately, I think some 40 minutes, not 40 minutes, maybe an hour or an hour and a half after the meeting, was released by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That press release, again, as you pointed to, was all about signaling. It was not at all about the concessions, or it didn't even mention the words rare earths or soybeans or tariffs. It was all about how the Chinese people and the state is very, very resilient, and implicitly it's about the US throws. So whatever the US throws its way, its economy is ready to kind of deal with it. So the other takeaway from that MOFA readout was them saying that there was consensus on resolving the issues of trade and tech, but there was no consensus on how or what the tangible elements of that resolution are. So anyone, following the meeting from the morning to eventually coming to this readout, it would feel like, everything Trump said to the media on Air Force One as soon as the meeting gave over. We've secured so many victories for the American people, for the US. She has assured me, Trump said, that he's going to pause the export licenses on rare earths and all that. All of that seemed fake in that minute, right? And it felt like you can't trust Trump. Maybe we just have to wait for the White House readout to come. But about 45 minutes later, we see another press release from the Chinese side. And this is from the Ministry of Commerce. In that, we see a lot of the things that Trump has talked about actually being penned down and materialized. Even though the White House official press release came on the 1st of November, which is a day and a half after the meeting, the Chinese actually confirmed it before the Americans, or after Trump and before the White House, that there is a 1 year pause on the export licenses required vis-a-vis rare earth elements and magnets as announced on the 9th of October. So they've not said anything about the April 2025 restrictions. And they also said that in exchange for the US stopping Section 301 investigations on the dual use nature of Chinese shipbuilding and the US dumping off the 10% quote unquote fentanyl tariff and bringing the total tariff from 57 to 47%. Only because of these is China also thinking about removing some of the countermeasures it imposed in exchange of these actions by the US, right? Now, they don't go into the specificities of the countermeasures, but we know them from following the events of the year. And then we see them being explicitly clarified in the White House readout that comes a day and a half later. And mind you, the Chinese, even in the Ministry of Commerce readout, are not talking about agreeing to buy soybeans, even though we hear from Trump just a few hours before that she has assured me and China has assured me that they're going to continue to buy soybeans, which, by the way, is really a sore point of contention in at least the trade war, right? But then we see the White House really clarify things point by point, and you see the October 9 rare earth element and magnet restrictions being mitigated for a year. In exchange, Section 301 on Chinese shipbuilding goes away. And the deadline of that investigation coming into effect gets extended from November 25 to 26. So one more year of those quote unquote investigations going on under the radar, but not necessarily resulting in any sorts of restrictions or sanctions. In the same way, they say the countermeasures China has agreed to remove include them not exporting hard fentanyl, them stopping the investigations on American entities and manufacturers, because China has its own entity list. It's not just the US, right? And of course, soybean, that they've agreed to buy soybean. So a collective reading of all of these materials kind of tells you that yes, there were major breakthroughs vis-a-vis soybean, rare earths, tariff countermeasures, shipbuilding measures, entities, and all of these induce a sense of positivity among firms, because as we say, trade happens between companies and people and not necessarily between governments. I think, as I said before, it's more of a delay, which in and of itself is a good thing. And we'll see where it goes from here. And mind you, the April rare earth restrictions, other aspects of the trade war, steel, for example, the Chinese said nothing about it. They are still to be thought about.
Okay. So before we zoom into any of those specific measures, uh, based on your reading of this meeting in comparison to all the other summit level meetings that have taken place between the two countries, what do you see? Is this a temporary relief that will eventually make way to a broader, more institutionalized set of agreements between the two countries that will go into stabilizing the relationship to an extent? Or do you think it is more of a wait and watch kind of a game where they have, like you said, stopped things from going awry for a year and then reevaluating based on how things stand?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is the $1 million question. But, in the past 2-3 years, this less than leader level dialogue, which is still high level political dialogue, political and economic dialogue, has been a consistent feature of diplomacy between US and China. In 23 and 24, the pioneers of this were people like Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken and Gina Raimondo, who would talk about foreign policy, military, trade, and tech. Right? Even the American Commerce Secretary would come and meet Wang Yi, which is Chinese foreign minister, or representatives from the Ministry of Commerce. And this would happen in that April, May, June, July period in 23, in 24, and this year as well. Although this year it was largely focused on specific tech and economic issues. And I haven't seen a lot of discussion on military de-escalation, not thinking about Taiwan and all of that. And that largely comes from the nature of the Trump administration. But I think the only time Blinken's visit to China, which even in 23, I believe, if I'm not wrong, was supposed to be an iconic moment because it was the two sides talking, was delayed because of the balloon incident when quote unquote Chinese balloon, spy balloon was floating over the American airspace, right? And then there were all sorts of deliberations around the America shooting it down, it not being a spy balloon, it being a balloon sent by the Ministry of State Security of China, so on and so forth. So the psychological impact of some of these events can often leave a bad taste and derail diplomacy. So just like the balloon incident, I do not discount the possibility that there could be other similar incidents that at times make it feel like the US and China are going to escalate this to near conflict, and it's going to have drastic repercussions for the global economy and security. But till then, what has happened at this meeting is our best bet, even if it is temporary. And I agree with you, agree with the former part of your question on this, that it is a temporary truce, if I may say that, or a pressing of pause. But actually, the relationship is so tense that and so many issues are now up in the air that I don't think that this is going to translate 1 year on into a, a, a complete removal of any sort of restrictions. And B, that we must appreciate this temporary truce, but also realize that in the next 2 months, anything can induce a flux and eventually lead either of the sides to renege. I hope that doesn't happen, and most likely it won't. But other things can be thrown up into the air because of these trigger factors, even as the consistent stressor of there being a tension in the US China relationship remains. So, that escalatory ladder is one to watch out for. What are China's buttons that the US can put? What are US's buttons that China can push? So, those are the things that can really derail conversation. And there isn't a possibility that they won't occur.
Thank you. That was a fantastic overview. I want to understand what all of it means for India, but before that, just to like go into some of the specific resolutions that were reached. We spoke about a few things like the shipping and fentanyl and agriculture as well, agricultural exports from the US. But some reports say that there was a consensus reached on the TikTok issue, which is something I'm thinking our listeners will be curious about. So, why is TikTok such an important discussion point for at this level of political deliberation? Can you give us a brief glimpse into that?
Yeah. I think one thing is from the Chinese perspective that TikTok is a national champion. With the Chinese, it's not just about hard trade and exports. To a great degree, it is also to do with the software that comes with it. So I think just the sheer amount of backlash against some of these technological offerings coming out of China, even though, the CEO of TikTok has often said that we're not a Chinese firm, we're a Singaporean firm. Right? Nonetheless, the fact is that ByteDance is an owner, and suddenly because of the global backlash, and not just in the US, but the global backlash against this free flow of data to China has obviously created a sentiment of hostility among Chinese firms, because it's not just ByteDance, but also Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, media firms like Sohu and Sina that are offering a lot of these software services. May it be media conversations, something like a chat, or social media where you post pictures or memes or videos. So a lot of these platforms offer this. And if you look at the US entity list, many of them are under investigation or are blacklisted. Sohu, for all purposes, should be something that's open to a country like the US to read on, because that's where you're hearing the pulse of the people in China and the pulse of the commentators in China. As an academic, it's absolutely pertinent that I have access to it, but it's not. But it's on the entity list in the US. So there is a clear backlash against this free flow of data, and there is some lack of transparency because there is deep mistrust. So suddenly, if even China comes to India tomorrow and says there are no back doors, there's that video going viral where Xi Jinping tells the South Korean leader, head of state, that we're gifting you a Xiaomi, but you should check if there's a backdoor. That's the kind of mistrust even China acknowledges exists now in the world. So I think that is why TikTok is a big concern, because for China this is about ego and technological offerings and how this was okay 2 years ago, but suddenly everything's up in the air and nothing's certain. And for the US it's a problem because there is pan securitization. I know securitization is a very investment word, but let's use it for now, right? You understand what it means: weaponization, adding of the security angle to everything. And so you would know this better than I would, that there were discussions that there'll be a project Oracle where users of TikTok in the US will have their data stored in the country. And, sharks like Kevin O'Leary were talking about investing in that data localization process, right? The thing is that, again, I'm not sure how much of it has been seen through, but you understand why it's a sore thumb sticking out, because there's no resolution and China wants one. And for the US, it has to be a long road of discussion. And if I may quickly add one point about semiconductors as well, right? I think we didn't touch upon that, but I did allude to what Hensen Yuang wanted to say. You will also notice that in this meeting, and you largely notice this from Trump making a comment to the media after the meeting. He was asked what happens to NVIDIA's Blackwell chips being sold to China. Is there a consensus on that? And he says that is between NVIDIA and China to resolve. Now, that's so interesting because, and you have parallel reports somewhere or the other that China is now encouraging its firms to not use H20 chips, to not use NVIDIA chips. We don't need American chips, especially if that chip is stripped down, because at one point the discussion was that China won't get Blackwell, but they will get something that is of the second or the third tier as compared to that standard. So in this back and forth, obviously egos are involved. But the one thing that is interesting is, how is it that in the past 5 to 7 years, the government has changed the landscape for its industry so much that they'll be fearful of committing to an investment in China, and still have, and we still witness Trump saying something to the tune of, this is between NVIDIA and China. Actually, it really isn't. It is between the US and China.
Yeah.
And NVIDIA is a big, massive player, arguably the world's most, valuable company and all of that. But it is to a big extent at the whims and fancies of the administration, the government of the day. And this is not a Republican thing. This is not a Trump thing. We saw this under Biden as well. Technological restrictions continued and were expanded on even. So that point really stuck out to me, and I'm sure the Chinese see the irony in it.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it is pretty crazy that meeting between two political leaders has largely been about economics and trade and technology, which is something governments facilitate but don't really do. It's all about the implications and the outcomes are mainly affecting companies from both countries. So that is very interesting. Another thing that I was curious about was the rare earths. Uh, First of all, when the whole thing was announced, it was puzzling because my reading of this was based on the Chinese declaring that they won't buy coal from Australia a few years ago. And then the whole supply chains just got rerouted, that Australians started selling to somebody else and the Chinese started buying from somebody else. And eventually it didn't really, change things at the grand scale. But rare earths seem to have been an outlier from this pattern because it seemed like the Americans did blink, that it did affect their their interests, and it came up during the meeting, and the rare earth issue, as they called it, was settled as per if you believe Trump. So what how do you see that? How do you view this issue?
Yeah, a great point, Ashwin, because at least it does seem in this fleeting moment that the rare earth restrictions, the new ones at least, made America blink. And this is because, and we have so many conversations about this at Takshashila when the gallium germanium nitride restrictions came about in April, if I'm not wrong, or late last year. It was about how we heard nothing about it once the restrictions were out, right? It didn't really impact anything, and all of those conversations about gallium having such uses in defense and it's going to halt the American fighter jet program, none of those seem to have appeared in the news cycle. But what happened with these October 9 restrictions, and the restrictions themselves are outliers from China's perspective, and so what happened is that the panic in industry must have been intense because this is essentially license raj with Chinese characteristics, right? They're not saying it's a ban, but they're saying that if we find marginal 0.1% of Chinese origin rare earth used by an exporter or even a re-exporter, a country like India, where a Chinese rare earth firms exports raw materials and then India uses it to re-export to another economy, and China is not even the direct exporter. Even 0.1% of material found there is a problem and a violation of the export licensing requirements, and so China is going to crack down on a firm hard on a firm like that. And for firms like this, let's say that there is a kernel of truth in what Bajaj said in April. Bajaj, the automobile firm in India, it said 40 to 45 days worth of rare earths is all we have. And after that, we're going to see a halt. So let's say that is true, plus minus 10 days. You see how if these October 9 regulations are to come into effect on December 1, it will immediately strike panic because now they think they have 2 months and they know that 40 days later, their licenses will really be around the corner, and they will run out of a stockpile. So panic would mean a quest to stockpile. Industry would be calling somebody in the White House or somebody in the administration saying, look, you got to get us out of this. Trump has to negotiate with Xi and at least get guarantees for American firms. We don't care about the rest of the world. So you see how that incremental weaponization of what we acknowledge as Chinese dominance at this juncture can strike panic. Now, in the long term, and I agree with a lot of assessments on this, there can be viable alternatives. The industry size is very small, just 170 million in the US, easily replaceable. There is process to process substitution, there is material to material substitution. But in the next 3 years, can you also set up a mining facility, also build separation and processing capabilities for rare earths, and then also become an exporter that others can rely on at the same cost advantage that China is offering something to you? That is what we say when we mean dominance in various aspects of the supply chain, right? So in the next 3 to 5 years, that might be really hard because the same assessments that argue that there is substitutability, there are alternatives, the market is small, will also acknowledge that it takes 16 and a half years for mining and separation to be materialized in an economy that's starting from scratch, by the way. India is starting from scratch, for example. And then eventually it comes to export and earning money out of it, right? So for the private sector, this is simply too high of an entry barrier. The startup cost is unbelievable. So if India has rare earth deposits, say in Ladakh, it just can't immediately start using them and processing them, right? Now, on the counter side, there is also the argument to be made that the Chinese have been doing this for a long time and their separation machinery has depreciated, it's not cutting edge anymore. But if they suddenly realize that everyone's doing China plus one in rare earths, why will they also not innovate and move forward, right? Yeah. Because they want to maintain that dependency. Yeah. Just like Moore's law applies to semiconductors, and semiconductor manufacturers and designers will always want to be on the cutting edge because they don't want to lose their jobs. So, or they want to stay at the frontier. So a lot of logic and nuance is necessary here to be able to realize that the impact can indeed be drastic in the next 3 years, especially with the October 9 restrictions, which are not just about elements and magnets that go into cars and phones, make them less bulkier, make them easy to use, make them cheaper, but also about equipment. So the Chinese are putting export licenses on processing equipment, on use of Chinese technology and IP intellectual property in processing equipment. So if you think that you're just going to buy processing equipment from the Chinese and that's going to solve your problems, that's covered too. Lithium batteries are covered too. Samarium metals
Yeah.
are covered too. So the extent, the marginality, if that's a word, and the time in which it is supposed to come into effect, all of them have created the kind of panic it has, and that's why we've maybe seen America, as you said, blink.
Well, okay. Thanks, Anushka. That was very insightful. And the last question that I have for you is to do with where India stands in all this and what India should take away. So, from speaking from an Indian national interest perspective, how should India read these announcements and resolutions by the two countries, and how should we chart our path ahead, given that this is what we have, the information we have?
Cool. So, I guess just quick points on that. One is, like I said, we should take the rare earth restriction seriously. And at least in the economic space, we should be open to negotiating with the Chinese, even if it leads to some concessions on purely the trade and economic or investments front, right? For the longest time, we've talked about restricting Chinese investments in the economy. And now, to be honest, I don't even know if Chinese elite opinion is in favor of investing in India, because they realize that India just might be a viable alternative in the China plus one scheme. So that's the kind of opinion going around and going into the ears of Xi Jinping, right? That maybe if we really want to restrict India's growth, and anyway, it's not like India was our top 10 profit market. Let's just go all out, right? So I guess we need to try and find a way to circumvent that and to really get some investment going. And then eventually investment becomes a two-way street. And we've done things to Xiaomi in the past, we can do them again if we feel like things are going awry on the border. But these are just things to think about, right? So Indian national interest is economic growth, Viksit Bharat by 2047, whatever, 10 trillion GDP by 2015, things like that, right? So, what do we need for that should be something we don't compromise on in the same domain. So, in terms of economic growth, if we need Chinese investments and imports, we need them. So, the goal should be in the short term to negotiate similar concessions on the rare earths issue as the US did, even as we think about diversification, which brings me to my second point about how India absolutely cannot be complacent with concentration of supply chains. The geoeconomic environment is just not feasible to have such a concentration of supply chains in any economy or geography as we have seen in the past. So diversification is a must. And I know there's a lot of conversation on this, and no one's saying here that you decouple with China, become a bubble and just replace all imports you have with either domestic alternatives or with other alternatives in the world. But the de-risking angle of diversification is important. So where you have critical sectors where you just cannot have Chinese investments or imports coming in, or sectors where you've seen Chinese intent to weaponize, and that could lead to cascading effects for your economy and your people. That's where you need alternatives. So with rare earths, even as we continue to negotiate for now, in the future we can focus on making the Ladakh mines feasible and viable, so that eventually when we've mined enough and proven that there's material there, some private firm or some public sector firm will take an interest in investing in separation, or we find someone like Australia and do joint ventures in separation and processing, because that's where the meat is, right? Because rare earths, and this is something that's going around, rare earths are not really that rare and all of that. You need a very small amount for any device or any automobile. So if they are in abundance, I think processing, I guess then you have to move on to processing, right? So that's how I think we could think about where to diversify and where to invest. Now, it doesn't have to be in towels, and we don't have to make the 3 nanometer semiconductor chips in the country, but we can still think about 28 nanometer and how to find alternatives to be able to do that. We have a PSMC Tata, we have something in Assam, but now the time is right to really materialize it. And even go to American firms to be able to make the business environment in India feasible. Because in a way, and this will be my final point, it is suitable for India that the US and China are in a state of tension, and this in between state between two extremes, one extreme being absolute hostility and escalation, and the other extreme being a G2, right, where the two are just friends. This middle state where there is high level political dialogue but still competition is good for India, because again it is in Indian national interest to be able to extract concessions from both parties and not just the US for its own technological and economic growth. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Anushka. That was a fantastic overview of the whole situation, and I hope it was as insightful to our listeners as it was to me. We live in really interesting times. The world is in a flux, and we see these news articles were, typically a couple of times a year, but we keep seeing them every week now. So, very interesting times, at least as like intellectually curious researchers. But the stakes are high, and this is bound to continue, and we're bound to see developments happen in the issues that we have discussed. So when there is something, we can try and do a follow up and follow along as it happens. But this has been a very interesting conversation.
Likewise.
Thank you, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you.
Catch you at the next one.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.